as most of you know, V-Ray can be pretty confusing. The reason why it can be pretty confusing is because there's a lot of different variables that make up a final image. The easiest way to learn and understand what's happening in the back end of V-Ray is to break the image down into those components and tackle things one by one. Now, the way I'm going to explain things is I'm going to start from the top and we're going to work our way down to the bottom. At V-Ray's default core level, you really only need to worry about a couple of things: anti-aliasing and the scene subdivisions. Now, the anti-aliasing is what's going to give you clean edges around geometry and clean filtered textures, and it's also just looking in general for areas with harsh contrast. Which leads me to the next topic, which is the scene subdivisions. The subdivisions are going to give you smooth reflections, smooth shadows, and ultimately reduce the noise in your scene. The beauty and ultimately fall of V-Ray is that they're both linked together. So the more noise you have in an image, the faster it'll render, but at the same time you're making more work for the anti-aliasing engine, because it's sampling pixels based on the contrast from one pixel to the next. So the easiest way to explain that, and I will get into it eventually in this video, is to show you with simple checker texture. But to get started, we'll just start off simple, and what I'm going to get you to do is I'm going to introduce the different elements that make up the final image. So firstly, you want to put the V-Ray lighting pass in. The V-Ray lighting pass is going to show you where noise is being generated from light sources. Stuff like dome lights, things like that. IES lights, anything lighting related, the noise is being calculated in this pass. Next pass is reflection. That's going to be indirect reflection, not primary, like that's treated as specular. You're going to want to put global illumination in. That's not on by default in the scene, but we'll still add it. You want to put a sample rate pass in. I'll explain what that is in a second. And lastly, you want to put the specular in, which that's treated as primary reflections. So you've got 5 render passes. Make sure render time's ticked on, and we're just going to render this default scene and see what happens. You'll notice straight off the bat that there's quite a lot of noise in the shadows, which is a telltale sign that the default V-Ray settings are an absolute piece of shit. They can't be used in production, they can't be used in animation, and ultimately I've got no idea why they're set up that way. They're not really optimized at all. The default settings that Vlado describes to use are also not really great anymore once you get a deeper understanding of V-Ray. So this video is designed to be a very quick rundown of what's happening in the render engine that's causing your noise and causing your render times to increase or decrease. I will go into the separate categories in depth, but for this opening video, it's just a very quick kind of hack rundown of what's truly going on in V-Ray. Now, in order to reduce the render time and increase the quality from the default settings or any other settings you might currently be using, you need to understand a couple of laws within V-Ray. And one of those laws is the more noise you have, the more work the anti-aliasing engine has to do to clean up that noise. Now, the beauty is V-Ray's AA sampler is extremely fast. It's just quite often utilized in the wrong way. If you're getting it to only sample areas that need those samples, then it's going to be extremely quick. If the AA engine is sampling reflections, glossy values, things like that, then you're going to get a very slow render. And that's the reason why you get these exponential drop-offs when people are oversampling their images. Now, I'm getting a little bit technical there, so I'll just take a step back and explain to you how to simplify this process and how to visualize it and see what's actually going on in your scene. So if I swap to the sample rate pass, you'll see that there's basically a heat map from blue to red. So what is this pass? What is the sample rate pass? All it's showing you is the minimum and maximum subdivisions in a scene. So with these default settings of 1 and 4, we can see here that the AA engine is putting 4 samples in the red areas and 1 sample in the blue area. Anything in between is just a value, somewhere between 1 and 4. So now we need to understand what this map should look like. And there is a perfectly clear explanation of that. So what it needs to look like is you need it to be red on your geometry edges, on the edges of specular highlights, and on textures. This lets us know that you're utilizing the max number of subdivisions in the areas where it's most important. Where you don't want all these samples is in the glossy values like reflections, shadows, things like that. Those are the areas where V-Ray's subdivision sampler handles things much better. So I'll give you an explanation and I can predict what's going to happen with this map when we change settings in the scene. So this light at the moment, it's casting 8 subdivisions into the scene. It's actually the multiple of that, but it doesn't matter. We'll just get started. Let's just call it a flat 8. So if we up the subdivisions on this light to 32 and re-render, let's see what happens. All of a sudden you've got a completely different looking map. And if you understand what those values mean, like I was saying earlier, you're seeing the minimum and maximum subdivision value, you might be a bit confused as to why it's changed so heavily. Now the reason is, if we go into the lighting pass now, the lighting pass is much smoother. There's less contrast from pixel to pixel. In fact, there's almost very little. If you go in and actually sample each pixel, it's like 0.001 between each pixel. So we've effectively killed a lot of noise in the image, and now the AA engine doesn't need to sample those pixels as much because there's less contrast in them. So once again, if I go back to the sample rate pass, we see it's not perfect yet. There's still a lot of AA happening in areas where it's not needed. So we need to understand where that noise is coming from. And this is the beauty of seeing all the individual render elements. So now if we swap to the reflection element, you'll see there's quite a lot of noise. And it almost visually represents exactly what's happening in the sample rate pass. You'll see here around the edges of those reflections that there's quite a bit of contrast between black and mid-gray values, and you get these kind of firefly-like pixels. So if we go into the material now, and we change the material subdivisions up higher, we're going to smooth out that reflection pass. So I'll just render that. In order to best demonstrate this, I'm going to need to go even higher on the subdivisions because I'm trying to completely eliminate that noise. So we can just test that, and it's always good to go up in increments to figure things out. So we're at 64 subdivisions now. There's still quite a bit of noise. Maybe not to the untrained eye, but to anyone who's trying to handle these render settings, that's still quite a bit of noise. So we can actually go higher there. So if I double that again, and we use 8 subdivisions, the render time is going up quite a lot. But we're almost completely noise-free now. So as that's rendering, I'm going to swap to the sample rate pass and show you now that those areas here are going to be a lot less green because we're getting less AA samples put into those areas, because now the material subdivisions are taking over that work. And as you can see, it's quite a lot slower, but we're going to handle that in a second. So I'll just swap to the sample rate, and now there's almost, in fact, it's basically just utilizing 1 sample in these areas. Our image is almost completely noise-free, but it's an extremely long render now. So why is that? So we've increased the subdivisions on the light and the material, and predictably the render times have gone up quite substantially. So moving on from here, now that we've got a nice clean render, how do we start to reduce the render time? Now there's another law that you need to understand, and that's that the DMC image sampler is linked to the DMC sampler. It's like the material samples. So the max number here is linked to the global subdivs in the scene, which effectively means if I increase this value to 8, all my material subdivisions, all my light subdivisions, all my GI subdivisions are quartered. And that's going to lead to a noisier render and a faster render. And that's extremely confusing to people because they, as you'd expect, you just want to be able to increase the AA and the render time goes up and the quality goes up. But that's not how V-Ray works. The reason why that's not how V-Ray works is because it's trying to intelligently balance the AA versus the subdivisions for you. That is what the math is attempting to do. It just doesn't do a very good job of it off the bat. You need a little bit of user input to get you over the line. So how can you visually see that? Well, we need to go back into the sample rate pass and take a look at what's happening here still. Now, what I can tell from this as a user who's got a trained eye in looking at this sample rate pass is that there's way too much AA happening. And there's still AA happening in areas where it's not exactly needed. You can see the transition here between pixels is pretty smooth. We don't necessarily need AA in those areas. So we need to start refining some values. Before I change anything, I'm just going to get rid of this anti-aliasing filter because it's just not needed. 99 out of 100 times. All that's designed to do is to get rid of high frequency noise in textures and things like that. So you've probably all come across moire and stuff in animation. So that's where you need that filter. In print though, like I said, I don't really use it. It's not needed. And the AA sampler itself handles that perfectly fine. So now that that's off, I'm just going to re-render. You're going to see basically the exact same render. Maybe it's going to be like 10 seconds quicker because it's not having to do those extra filtering calculations. So just let that render, see how much faster it is. Just going to pause the render and we'll start it up when it's finished. So the render's finished and we cut 8 seconds off the render time just by removing the anti-aliasing filter. So it's not needed, it's the same render. It won't be pixel for pixel the exact same, but it's close enough visually where you can't even tell the difference. So now that that's out of the way, we need to start refining a couple of other values. So if I increase the max AA value, like I said earlier, that's going to reduce a lot of the sampling on the material and the lights. So if I move it up to 8 and we re-render again, what this tells me is that the render is going to go faster and it's going to be noisier. So if I just zoom in here and we just see these buckets as they come out, you see more noise being introduced. So we've got a render time of 42 seconds now. However, we've reintroduced noise because knowing that these values are linked, the max subdivs and the global subdivs, by increasing that value to 8, we've got less sampling in the scene. So we need to counter that again. And you can see it starts to become a little bit of a balancing act between AA and sampling. So to eliminate a bit of that confusion, you need to start getting used to looking at the sample rate pass and looking at the individual render elements. So let's take a look at the sample rate.